Let me start by saying something that might sound uncomfortable, even a little rebellious, if you're still studying English the way you studied subjects in school. You're slowing yourself down, not because you're incapable, not because you lack discipline, but because language doesn't grow in classrooms or notebooks. It grows in environments. And this is where most people miss the point entirely. Think about how you learned your first language. No grammar book, no vocabulary lists. No one sat you down and said, "Today we will study sentence structure." You learned because you were inside it. It surrounded the language. It surrounded you. It spoke to you before you could speak back. Your brain didn't treat it as information. It treated it as survival. Communication meant connection. And that changes everything. Now compare that to how most people try to learn English at home. They isolate it. 30 minutes of study, a worksheet, a video. Then they close the book and return to their real life as if English belongs in a separate mental box. But the brain doesn't work like that. The brain learns what it's exposed to repeatedly, emotionally, and without pressure. That's not opinion, that's neuroscience. Here's the shift that changed everything for me. I stopped asking, how do I study English better? And started asking, how do I live inside English, even at home? That question alone reframes the entire process. Because when English becomes part of your environment, effort drops and absorption rises. You stop forcing progress and start allowing it. This doesn't mean you abandon structure. It means you redesign it. Instead of treating English like a task, you integrate it into things you already do. You watch content you genuinely enjoy. But in English, not to understand every word, but to let the rhythm, tone, and patterns sink in. You listen while cooking, walking, resting. You let English exist around you the way background music does at first, until one day it's no longer background. It's familiar. It's comfortable. And comfort is not the enemy of growth. Fear is. One of the biggest psychological mistakes language learners make is believing that struggle equals progress. That if it feels hard, it must be working. But what actually accelerates language acquisition is comprehensible exposure. Input that's just slightly above your level, delivered consistently without emotional threat. When your brain feels safe, it opens. When it feels judged or pressured, it shuts down. This is why environment matters more than effort. A supportive environment lowers resistance. And when resistance drops, learning speeds up. You don't need heroic discipline. You need intelligent design. Here's another truth most people don't want to hear. You don't need more vocabulary. You need more familiarity. The brain learns patterns before rules. It learns tone before accuracy. When you live inside the language, grammar starts to make sense after you feel it, not before. Rules stop being abstract ideas and start becoming explanations for things you already recognize. And this is deeply philosophical when you think about it. Language is not just a tool for communication. It's a lens for perception. The more you're exposed to English, the more you start thinking differently, structuring ideas differently, even reacting differently. You're not just learning words, you're borrowing a worldview. That's why immersion works. It changes how you interpret reality. At home, this is your advantage. You control the environment. You decide what plays in the background. You decide what language your inner dialogue experiments with. You decide whether English is a guest that visits occasionally or a resident that lives with you. And no, you don't need to understand everything. Confusion is not failure, it's familiarity in progress. The brain is remarkably good at sorting chaos when given time and repetition. Your job is not to control the process, but to stay inside it long enough for it to work. When people say, "I understand English, but I can't speak," what they're really saying is, I've kept English at a distance. Understanding comes from exposure. Fluency comes from closeness. You have to let the language sit with you, interrupt you, become normal. So if there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this: stop treating English like something you visit for an hour a day, and start treating it like a place you live. Because the moment English becomes part of your environment, not your schedule, learning stops feeling like work and starts becoming inevitable. Now, once English is no longer something you study, but something you live inside, you run straight into the next obstacle. And this one has nothing to do with vocabulary, accents, or grammar. It's your mind. Because for most people, the real barrier to fluency isn't linguistic, it's psychological. Let me say this clearly: if you freeze when you speak, if your mind goes blank, if you overthink every sentence before it comes out, your problem is not English. Your problem is how your brain responds to perceived risk. The moment you open your mouth in a second language, your brain quietly asks a dangerous question: is this safe? Safe to make a mistake. Safe to sound foolish. Safe to be judged. And if the answer is no, even subconsciously, the brain activates protection mode. Thoughts slow down. Words disappear. You know more than you can access, and that gap feels humiliating. This is why people say, "I know English, but I can't speak." What they really mean is, my brain doesn't feel safe enough to let me use what I know. So before grammar, before fluency, before confidence, there's a deeper skill you have to train: your ability to act while uncomfortable. Most learners wait for confidence before speaking. But confidence is not a prerequisite, it's a result. Psychologically, confidence comes from evidence. And evidence only comes from action. You don't think your way into confidence. You behave your way into it. This is where the entire learning strategy flips. Instead of asking, "How can I speak correctly?" you start asking, "How can I speak before I feel ready?" That single shift trains your nervous system to tolerate imperfection. And tolerance is what unlocks progress. Here's something most people don't realize: the brain doesn't distinguish between a real threat and a social one very well. Speaking imperfect English can trigger the same stress response as physical danger: faster heartbeat, shallow breathing, mental fog. But the danger isn't real. It's learned. And anything learned can be unlearned. The way you unlearn it is not by avoiding mistakes, but by normalizing them. Every time you speak and nothing bad happens, even when you make errors, you send a powerful signal to your brain: this is survivable. Over time, the brain relaxes. Access improves. Fluency begins to emerge not because you learn more, but because fear stopped blocking what was already there. This is why perfectionism is so destructive in language learning. It disguises itself as high standards, but psychologically it's just fear wearing a suit. Perfectionism delays action, and delayed action delays evidence. And without evidence, confidence never arrives. There's also a philosophical layer here that matters. Language is not about being correct. It's about being understood. Human communication has always been imperfect. We gesture. We pause. we search for words. Even in our native language, we're constantly approximating meaning. Expecting flawless English before you speak is not intelligence. It's an unrealistic demand that no human meets. Once you accept that, something changes. You stop performing and start participating. And participation is where growth lies. A practical shift that changes everything is this: stop monitoring yourself while you speak. Self-monitoring splits your attention. Part of your mind is trying to communicate, the other part is judging. You can't do both well. Fluency requires presence. Judgment pulls you out of it. This is why speaking to yourself, recording voice notes, or narrating your thoughts in English is so powerful. There's no audience, no threat. You train expression without fear. You're teaching your brain that English is a space for exploration, not evaluation. And here's the paradox that surprises most people. When you stop trying to sound fluent, you actually become fluent faster. Because fluency is not smoothness, it's flow. And flow only appears when resistance is low. So if you feel stuck, don't ask what you're missing academically. Ask what you're avoiding emotionally. Because the language you want is often sitting right behind the fear you refuse to face. Train your brain to move first and judge later. Speak before you feel ready. Allow mistakes without drama. Because the moment you prove to yourself that you can survive imperfection, English stops being something you fear and starts becoming something you use. Once your environment is doing the heavy lifting and your mind is no longer blocking you with fear, you'd think progress would become automatic. But this is where most people hit another wall. Not because they lack intelligence or desire, but because they rely on motivation. And motivation is a terrible long-term strategy. Motivation is emotional. It rises when you're inspired and disappears when you're tired, busy, or discouraged. And learning a language at home means you will face all three. So if your English plan depends on feeling motivated, it's already unstable. What actually creates fluency is not intensity. It's consistency. And consistency doesn't come from motivation. It comes from systems. A system is something you do regardless of how you feel. It removes decision making. It removes negotiation. You don't wake up asking, do I feel like brushing my teeth today? You just do it. English has to move into that category. Not something you hope to do, but something that simply happens. Here's the mistake people make. They design systems that are too big. 1 hour a day, 5 resources, a complex schedule. And when life interrupts, as it always does, the system collapses. Then guilt appears, then avoidance, then weeks pass. The brain doesn't resist learning, it resists overwhelm. So the secret is to go smaller than your ego wants. So small that failure feels almost impossible. 10 minutes of listening. 1 paragraph spoken out loud. 1 short reflection in English. That's it. You don't aim to be impressive. You aim to be repeatable. Psychologically, this matters because small actions bypass resistance. The brain doesn't argue with something that feels easy. And once you start, momentum quietly takes over. You often do more than planned. But even if you don't, the system still works. This is where compounding comes in. 10 minutes feels insignificant today. But the brain doesn't measure progress emotionally. It measures it through repetition. Neural pathways strengthen through frequency, not effort. What you repeat daily reshapes how you think, how you recognize patterns, how quickly words surface. Philosophically, this is a lesson far bigger than language. We tend to overestimate what we can do in a short burst and underestimate what small, consistent actions can do over time. Fluency is not a breakthrough event. It's an accumulation process. Another important shift is this separate success from results. Your job is not to sound fluent today. Your job is to show up today. Systems succeed when the only measure of success is completion, not performance. Did you do the 10 minutes? Then you won. How well it went is irrelevant. This removes emotional friction. When performance is the goal, the brain becomes tense. When completion is the goal, the brain relaxes. And relaxed brains learn faster. At home, systems also protect you from perfectionism. You don't wait for the perfect time. You don't optimize endlessly. You follow the system. And paradoxically, this creates freedom. You no longer carry English as a mental burden throughout the day. It has its place. It gets done. There's also something powerful about identity here. When you show up daily, even briefly, you stop seeing yourself as someone trying to learn English. You become someone who uses English every day. Identity shifts through evidence, not affirmations. And once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. People often ask, how long will it take? That question misses the point. Systems don't promise timelines. They promise direction. If your system is small enough to survive bad days, boring days, and busy days, fluency becomes a matter of time, not willpower. So if you've been waiting for motivation, stop. Design a system that works, even when you don't feel like working. Make it simple. Make it daily. Make it non-negotiable. Because the truth is this, you don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And when your system is strong enough, the fluency stops being something you chase and starts becoming something you can't avoid. And now we come to the part of the plan that most people avoid, postpone, or quietly hope they can skip: output, speaking, writing, producing English instead of just consuming it, because this is where learning stops feeling safe and starts feeling real. Let me be direct, true. Input alone will never make you fluent. Listening and reading are essential, yes, but they are incomplete. They prepare the mind, but they don't train it to act. Fluency is not recognition, it's retrieval. And retrieval only happens when you force your brain to produce language on demand. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most learners hide in input because it feels productive without being risky. You can watch videos for hours. You can read articles. You can nod along and think, I understand this. And understanding feels like progress. But understanding is passive. It doesn't test you. It doesn't expose gaps. It doesn't demand courage. Output does all three. The moment you try to speak or write, reality appears. You realize which words are missing, which structures are shaky, which thoughts collapse halfway through a sentence. And instead of seeing this as failure, you have to see it for what it actually is: information. Output gives feedback. Clear, immediate, honest feedback. And the brain learns fastest when feedback is unavoidable. Psychologically, this is powerful. When you struggle to express an idea, the brain becomes alert. It starts searching. It creates stronger memory traces because the need is real. This is called desirable difficulty. It's uncomfortable, but it's efficient. Passive input whispers to the brain. Output forces the brain to pay attention. This is why people who speak early, even badly, improve faster than people who wait to feel ready. They're not braver. They're just training the right muscle. And notice something important here. Output doesn't mean public performance. It doesn't mean debates, presentations, or perfect pronunciation. Output starts privately, speaking to yourself, explaining a concept out loud, recording voice notes and listening back, writing short reflections, summaries, opinions. Low pressure, high frequency. When you talk to yourself in English, something fascinating happens. Thought slows down just enough to become visible. You notice how ideas form. You notice patterns repeating. You begin to think English, not translate into it. And that's a turning point. Philosophically, output is an act of ownership. When you produce language, you stop being a consumer and become a participant. The language is no longer something external you observe. It becomes something you shape, and identity shifts again. You're not learning English. You're using it to express you. Another reason output accelerates learning is emotional. Every time you express yourself and survive the stakes, you weaken fear. You prove to yourself that imperfection is not dangerous. And as fear dissolves, the fluency emerges naturally. Not because you memorized more rules, but because nothing is blocking access anymore. There's also a myth worth breaking here. People believe they need more input before they can output. But in reality, output creates demand for input. When you struggle to express something, you suddenly care about the missing word, the structure, the phrasing. And when you later hear it in input, it sticks deeply, permanently. This creates a feedback loop. Output reveals gaps. Input fills them. Output tests again. This loop is where real fluency lives. Not in endless preparation, but in interaction between effort and exposure. And yes, output will feel messy at first. Sentences will be simple. Thoughts will feel limited. That's not a sign you're failing. It's a sign you've started. Complexity comes after use, not before it. Every fluent speaker you admire once sounded exactly where you are now. The difference is not talent, it's repetition. If you've done everything else, built the environment, trained your mindset, designed the system, but you avoid output, you've built a road and refuse to walk it. Progress doesn't reward intention, it rewards engagement. So here's the invitation. Speak before you're confident. Write before you're polished. Express before you're perfect. Because language is not mastered in silence. It's built in motion. And if you remember nothing else from this entire plan, remember this: fluency is not something you prepare for. It's something you practice into existence.